Her father's shop smelled of hot iron and green sawdust, and she was small enough that the bench came to her chin. He was trying to split a twisted piece of mesquite, and the axe rang off it and jumped back near his leg. He laughed, put the ugly gray wood in her hands, and told her to feel the weight of it. "The stubborn ones," he said. "Once you set them, they don't move again for anything." She was 6. She forgot it for 20 years. She remembered it the winter she stood alone with a child in a house. The wind walked through, as though the walls were not there. The wagon stopped because the mare would not go on. Lenora Pritchard sat with the reins loose in her cracked hands and looked at what she had bought. Ahead of her, where the deed promised timbered creek land with a dwelling, the ground rose into a wall of dead mesquite. Black branches, thorns the length of a finger, trunks burned to the color of old iron, entangled so thickly that the afternoon light came through them in thin broken lines. The brush ran east along Sweetwater Creek farther than she could see. It stood higher than a man on horseback, and it smelled of char and dust. Somewhere behind it, Mercer Blaine had told her, stood her house. "Belle," she said to the mare, "walk on." Belle did not walk on. The mare had smelled the thorns and set her feet, and Lenora did not blame her. On the seat beside her, her daughter Ruth pressed close against her arm. The girl was 6 years old, and she held the folded deed in both hands the way she might hold a bird. Ruth had held it since Mobeetie because her mother had told her it was the most important paper they owned, and Ruth had taken the words to heart. "Is that the trees?" Ruth asked. "That's the trees," Lenora said. Mercer Blaine rode up alongside the wagon on a good bay horse. He was a man of about 40, well dressed for that country, with a coat that had never done a day of labor, and a smile he put on the way another man might put on a hat. He had sold Lenora the tract in a land office in a town 3 days east, and he had ridden this last stretch with her because, he said, he wanted to see her settled. He did not ride his bay any closer to the brush than the wagon had come. "There it is," Blaine said. 160 acres. Sweetwater bottom, best water in the county. "Where is the house?" Lenora said. It was not a question. Blaine looked at the black tangle, and something moved behind his smile. "House is past the brush," he said. "There was a fire through here, year or two back, cleaned out the grass. The mesquite will want grubbing out, but that's honest work, and the land underneath is worth 10 times what you paid." "You told me timbered," Lenora said. "You told me a dwelling." "And there's timber," Blaine said, "and there's a dwelling. I never said the road to it was swept." Lenora climbed down from the wagon. Her legs had gone stiff from the days on the seat, and the ground came up hard through her boots, but she walked to the edge of the brush and put her hand on one of the dead trunks. It did not give. It was cold and hard as a stove leg, and the bark had burned away to leave the wood beneath smooth and gray. She pushed. The whole tangled mass shifted a half-inch and settled back, groaning, as if it were one thing and not 1,000. She had grown up south of there, where her father repaired wagons and fences, and sometimes took a mesquite log for an axle block because nothing else would hold. She knew this wood. She knew it was heavy as iron and near as stubborn, that it turned an axe, that it burned long and hot when a man could get it split. She knew that most people looked at a mesquite thicket and saw only the misery of clearing it. She looked at 40 acres of it and did not yet know what she saw, but it was not nothing. "Drive your horse in," she told Blaine. "Show me the way through to the house." Blaine did not move his horse. "Bay's skittish," he said. "Thorns." "Then walk him." Mrs. Pritchard. Blaine's smile had thinned to a line. I've done my part. The land's yours. There's a gap down by the creek a body can lead a horse through if she's patient. The house is a quarter-mile in. He gathered his reins. I'll tell you what I told you in town. This is hard country for a woman alone. If you find you've bit off more than you can chew, you send word to me in Mobeetie. I'll take the parcel back off your hands and give you $40 for your trouble. That's a kindness. You won't get another. He touched his hat to Ruth, who did not look at him, and he turned the bay and rode back the way they had come without once letting the horse near the thorns. Lenora watched him go. Then she looked at the wall of dead wood, and past it, where she could not yet see, to the house she had spent almost everything she had in the world to reach. She had $192 when her husband died. She had counted it on the kitchen table the week after they buried him, with Ruth asleep and the lamp burning oil she could not afford to burn, and she had understood then that the number was the whole shape of her life. There was no one behind it. Her husband's people were dead. Her own were 3 states away and had written her a letter, when they heard, that said they were sorry and that they could not take in 2 more mouths and that they hoped she understood. She understood. She sold what would not fit in a wagon. She sold the good bed and the churn and her husband's tools, all but the ones she thought she might need. And she got a fair price for none of it because everyone who buys from a widow knows she has to sell. When she was done, she had the wagon, the mare Belle, a small cast-iron stove, bedding, seed for a spring she had to live to see, food for a few weeks, and $192. The land cost $144. Filing and the last stretch of the journey took 14 more. She arrived on her own ground with $34 and a daughter and a mare that would not walk into the thorns. She led Belle down toward the creek on foot, Ruth walking behind her holding the deed, and she found the gap Blaine had spoken of, a place where the fire or the water had thinned the brush enough that a careful person could pass. Thorns caught her skirt and drew blood from the back of one hand. She got the mare through, and the wagon she left at the boundary because the wagon would not fit, and she carried what she could and came at last into a clearing beside the creek. The house stood in the middle of it. It was a cabin 16 feet by 20, built of cottonwood logs gone silver with weather, and it had been built by someone who left before they finished. The chinking had fallen out between the logs in a dozen places. The door hung from one leather hinge. There was a window with no glass and no shutter, and the stovepipe hole in the roof had no pipe, only a black ring of old smoke and a square of open sky. Inside, when she pushed the door aside, she found a dirt floor, a rope bed frame with no rope, a scatter of a former tenant's leavings, and a wind that came through the west wall as if the wall were not there. Ruth stood in the doorway and looked at it and did not cry, which was worse than crying. "It's just for now," Lenora said. "We'll close it up tight before the cold comes." She did not yet know how she would do that. She stood in the one room that was hers, and she felt the wind come through the gaps, and she did the arithmetic she would do 100 times before winter. $34. She needed food that would last until spring, because the seed in her sack would not feed anyone until there was a garden, and there would be no garden until there was no snow. She needed oats for Belle, or the mare would starve, and then there would be no way to work the land or leave it. She needed a stovepipe and an elbow to carry the smoke, or she would burn the house down trying to warm it. She needed lamp oil. She needed a shutter and a door and glass or something to stand in for glass. She needed winter clothes for a growing child who had come from a warmer country and owned one coat. And she needed wood, that above all. In that country, the winter did not merely make a person cold, it killed. She had heard the talk on the road east from freighters and drovers, that the norther came down off the plains with nothing to stop it between the cabin door and the top of the world, and that a family caught short of fuel in January was a family the neighbors found in March. Purchase lumber to close the house and build a woodshed and lay in a proper winter's fuel would cost far more than $34. It would cost more than she had ever had at one time, and every board she bought was food out of Ruth's mouth. She stood in the wind, and she understood the trap Blaine had set as neatly as if he had drawn it. He had sold her a place she could not make livable with the money it left her. He expected the cold to do the rest. He would ride out in the spring, find the cabin empty, and take back the good creek bottom for the price of $40 and a smile. She was 27 years old. She had a child. She had $34 and a house full of holes and 40 acres of dead thorns, and she had nowhere on the earth to go if she failed. That first night she nailed 2 blankets over the west wall, and the wind came through them anyway, carrying grit that she felt against her teeth. Ruth slept in her coat, with the stove burning the last of the dry cottonwood a former tenant had left, and Lenora lay awake, listening to the dead brush move in the dark. All night the wind worked through the great tangle out beyond the clearing, and the branches clicked and knocked against one another, thousands of them, a dry rattling sound like something enormous shifting in its sleep. She should have hated the sound. Instead, she lay and listened to it, and a thought began to turn over in her mind, slow and unwelcome, the way a heavy thing turns over in deep water before it shows what it is. The wind was loud out in the brush. Out here, past the edge of it, the wind was quieter. She did not sleep, but she stopped for a while, being afraid. In the morning, the man came. She heard the horse first and went out with her father's old skinning knife in her hand, because a woman alone learns to meet strangers with something in her hand, and she found a man of about 55 sitting a mule at the edge of her clearing, looking at her house the way a doctor looks at a sick man he has already decided will die. "You'd be the widow," he said. "Blaine said there was a widow. Blaine sent you." "Blaine asked me to look over the shack he sold you," the man said. He climbed down off the mule slow, the way a big man climbs down when his knees have gone bad. "Name's Orson Bell. No kin to your mare, I expect. I do carpentry, and I keep some stock, and I drove army wagons for 11 years before that, which is how I come to know more about wind and cold in this country than a body would choose to know." He looked at her knife and did not remark on it. "You can put that away. I'm too old and too tired to be any trouble to anybody." She did not put it away, but she let it hang at her side. Orson Bell walked to her house without asking and put his hand on the door that hung from its one hinge. He took a knife of his own from his belt, an old worn thing, and he set the point against a split board in the wall and pushed, and the point went into the depth of a finger joint. "Punk," he said, "this board's half rot. West wall's the same all along here." He nodded at the daylight coming in beside the door frame. "You feel that? That's your heat going out to the prairie. You could feed that stove all night, and this room would never come warm, not in a hard blow." He straightened and looked at the small heap of wood by the cold hearth. "That your fuel?" "Some of it." "Cottonwood," Orson said. He said the word the way another man might say a curse. "Burns fast, burns cold, throws no heat worth the name. You've got, what, a quarter cord there? You'll want 6 cords to see a winter through in a house tight enough to hold it, and this house won't hold it, and even if it would, you haven't got the wood." He looked at her plainly. He was not unkind. That was the terrible thing about him. He was not being cruel. He was telling her the truth, and the truth was that she would die. "You've got maybe 2 weeks of decent fuel if the winter turns mean. And in this country, ma'am, the winter turns mean." "The little pile is cottonwood," Lenora said. "The rest of the property is mesquite." Orson Bell looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed, not long, a short sound with no meanness in it and no hope in it either. "That's just it," he said. "The mesquite is exactly the problem. You know what it costs to grub out mesquite? You dig the whole root or it comes back at you. A crew of men with grubbing hoes, and a team makes a half-acre a week and hates every hour of it. You've got one mare and one child and one pair of hands, and you'd need to clear it, and buck it, and split it, and haul it, and every trunk of it will turn your axe and tear your harness. You'll be dead of the cold before you burn your way to a cleared field. He shook his head. I've seen the graves of people smarter than you thought they were. Blaine sold you a coffin with a creek running past it. I'm sorry, I truly am. But somebody had to say it to you plain, because that man surely won't. He got back on his mule. He looked at Ruth in the doorway, and something crossed his face, and he looked away. You've got till the first hard norther to change your mind, he said. Blaine will take it back. Take his $40 and go east while the roads are open. Then he rode away, and he did not look at the brush at all, as though it were already nothing to do with him. Lenora stood in the cold sun a long time. Everything he said was true. She knew it was true. She had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said the same thing his 11 years of army winters said. One woman could not grub 40 acres of mesquite. One woman could not buy a winter's lumber with $34. One woman with a child and a mare would freeze in a house full of holes on the open Panhandle, and in the spring Mercer Blaine would ride out whistling and take back his creek bottom. But the arithmetic assumed she meant to burn the mesquite. And in the night, listening to it move, she had begun to think that she did not. She walked to the wall of dead brush at the edge of her clearing, and she stood inside its shadow, where the wind off the creek dropped to almost nothing, and she held up her hand and felt the difference in the air. On the far side of the tangle, the wind cut. Here, behind even this narrow, raw edge of it, the air was only air. She turned and looked back at her broken house, sitting naked in the open ground beyond the reach of the brush, taking the full weight of the wind on its rotten west wall. The house was in the wrong place, or rather the wall was in the wrong place. The wall was out there, 40 acres of it, and it was standing between her and the very wind that meant to kill her. And no one in that country had ever thought to move it, because no one in that country had ever wanted anything from mesquite but to be rid of it. She did not have to grub it out. She had to bring it in. The idea came to her whole and terrifying, the way the thought had turned over in the dark, and now that she could see the shape of it, she was almost sorry, because a hopeless thing is at least simple, and this was not going to be simple. She could not clear the brush, but she could move it. Not all of it. She did not need all of it. She needed a thick ring of it drawn in close around her house, on the sides the wind came from, a barrier of dead mesquite standing between the norther and her rotten west wall. If the brush could quiet the wind out at its ragged edge, then brush brought in and stacked high and deep might quiet the wind that struck her home. She remembered her father then, and the memory came with a smell of green wood and hot iron. She had been a girl in his shop, and he had been trying to split a piece of mesquite for an axle block, and the axe had rung off it and rebounded near enough to his shin to make him swear. He had handed her the piece to hold and told her to feel the weight of it, and she had felt it, heavier than any wood that size had a right to be. The straight wood's easy and it's weak, her father had said. This here's the stubborn stuff. Fights you the whole way, but once you get a stubborn piece set where you want it, girl, it don't move again for love nor money. The crooked ones make the best blocks. They lock. He had turned the ugly, twisted piece over in his hands. Most folks throw the crooked ones on the fire. That's because most folks are in a hurry. She had been 6, near enough Ruth's age. She had filed it away and forgotten it for 20 years. She was not in a hurry now. She had until winter, which was no time at all, but she was not in a hurry the way her father meant. She was not going to throw the crooked wood on the fire. She was going to build with it. The next days she spent learning exactly how hard the thing would be. She harnessed Belle and led her to the near edge of the brush with a length of chain, and she worked the chain around the base of one dead trunk, and she set the mare to pull. The trunk did not come. It was locked into its neighbors by 100 thorned branches, and when Belle threw her weight into the collar, the whole mass shifted and held, and the mare's feet slid in the dust. Lenora unhooked and tried a trunk nearer the edge, one with fewer neighbors, and this one came, tearing free with a shriek of dragged branches, and Belle hauled it out into the clearing, and Lenora stood over it, breathing hard, and understood the true size of what she had chosen. The trunk was 12 feet long and heavier than a grown man. It had taken the two of them, woman and mare, most of an hour, and it was one. She looked at the brush that ran east along the creek out of sight, and she tried to think how many trunks were in it, and she could not, because the number was not a number a person could hold. She dragged 11 trunks that first day. Her hands split along the palms before noon, and she wrapped them in strips, torn from an old shift, and went on. She stacked the trunks in a rough line on the north side of the house, butt ends down, the way she would stack anything, and by evening she had a ragged, low pile 30 feet long and not quite to her shoulder, and it had cost her a day and most of the skin on her hands, and it looked like nothing at all against the great weight of the winter coming. That was when Martha Vickery rode in. Martha was a settler woman of about 33 from a claim 2 miles down the creek, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, managing her family's ground while her husband ran freight contracts to the fort and back. She had heard, the way people on a thin frontier always hear, that Blaine had sold the bottom to a widow, and she had come to look, and what she found was a woman with bleeding hands stacking dead mesquite against her house in the last light. Martha did not laugh. Lenora would remember that. Of all of them, Martha never once laughed, and that was what made her the hardest to bear. Martha got down and looked at the pile, and looked at Lenora's wrapped hands, and looked at the brush. "You mean to burn all that this winter?" Martha asked. "No," Lenora said. "I mean to stack it around the house, to break the wind." Martha was quiet a moment. She was not a fool, and Lenora watched her turn the notion over and find, to her credit, that it was not entirely foolish either. "Brush breaks wind," Martha said slowly. "I'll grant you that. My husband stacked tumbleweed and old fence against the north of our stock pen, and the calves winter better for it. I'll grant you brush breaks wind." She looked at the 30 feet of ragged pile that had cost a whole day. Then she looked deliberately at the miles of brush along the creek, and at the low sun, and at Belle standing spent in the traces. "But that's not the question, is it? The question is how much of it, and how high, and how fast. You did that today?" She pointed at the pile. 30 feet, not to your shoulder. One day, your hands are opened up already and your mare's blowing. How many days do you think you've got before the cold?" 6 weeks, Lenora said. "Maybe 7. "And you've got to close the house, too, and lay in food, and ready that mare for a hard winter, and feed a child." Martha's voice was not cruel, but it did not spare her. "I've buried a neighbor who ran out of fall doing the wrong thing. There's 100 right things you could do with 6 weeks, Mrs. Pritchard. Close the house tight, buy what fuel you can and cut the rest, beg a place at the fort if it comes to it. Those are all things that might save you." She looked at the pile again. "What happens if you spend the whole fall building the wrong thing? What happens if it's November and you've got half a brush wall and a cold house and no wood laid by, and it's too late to do any of the right things because you spent your 6 weeks on this?" It was the truest and hardest thing anyone had said to her, harder than Orson's plain verdict of death, because Orson only told her she would fail, and Martha told her she might fail at the wrong task, and there is no worse way to die than working hard at a mistake. If you've ever been helped by someone who still thought you were wrong, who lent you their hands while shaking their head, tell us in the comments. Lenora Pritchard was about to learn what that kind of help is worth. Lenora did not argue with her. She had learned in a year of being a widow that arguing with a sensible person only hardens them. Instead, she said, "Come back in 3 days. If I can't show you it works, I'll close the house and cut cottonwood like everybody else." Martha studied her. "That's fair," she said, surprised. "That's more than fair." She got back on her horse. 3 days. For 3 days, Lenora did not try to build the whole thing. She built one piece of it, and she built it right. She chose a spot northwest of the house, on the side the worst wind came from, and there she raised a section of wall no more than 30 feet long and only to the height of her shoulder. But she did not merely stack it. She remembered her father and the crooked wood that locks, and instead of laying the trunks straight, and even she let them lie the way they wanted to lie, fork against fork, the thorned crowns of one biting into the branches of the next, so that when she was done, the section was not a pile of separate logs, but one snarled, woven thing that she could lean her whole weight against and not shift. She packed the bottom foot of it with sod she cut from the creek bank, heavy wet squares of prairie root and earth, to hold the feet down and close the low gap where the wind ran fastest and coldest along the ground. On the 3rd day, the weather gave her what she needed. A dry, hard breeze came up out of the northwest, the front edge of the season turning, and Martha Vickery rode in as she had said she would. Lenora had cut 2 strips of pale cloth from the same worn shift that bound her hands. She tied one to a stake driven into open ground, out where the wind ran free. She tied the other to a stake set close behind her short new wall, in its shelter. Then she and Martha stood and watched. The strip in the open snapped straight out and cracked like a whip, over and over, straining at its knot. The strip behind the wall lifted and turned and wandered on the disordered air, but it did not snap and it did not crack. The wind came through the brush, but it came through broken into 100 smaller winds that fought each other and lost their teeth. And behind the wall, the air only stirred. Martha stood a long time watching the 2 strips of cloth. "Well," she said at last, "I'll be." Lenora had learned something too, watching, and it changed the whole shape of her plan. She had thought she wanted a wall. She saw now that she did not want a wall, not a solid one, because a solid thing only makes the wind climb it and pour down harder on the other side. She wanted the opposite. She wanted a thing the wind could enter and could not get through whole, a deep tangled field of resistance that would take the wind apart. The brush was not the poor substitute for a wall. The brush was the right thing, and a plank wall would have been the poor substitute for it. "It's not a wall," Lenora said half to herself, watching the sheltered cloth stir gentle in the killing wind. "It's a thicket. I have to keep it a thicket." "You have to keep it a great deal bigger than 30 feet is what you have to do," Martha said, but the scorn had gone out of her voice, and in its place was something worse for Lenora's peace of mind, because it was closer to fear. "You've proved the small piece. That's not the same as the storm. I've seen the wind in January take the roof off a soddy and roll a loaded wagon. You know what that much brush becomes if a real norther gets under it and it's not anchored right? It becomes a sail. It becomes 40 tons of thorn coming through your window." She gathered her reins. "You've proved brush breaks wind. You haven't proved you can build the thing big enough to matter without it killing you when the weather comes to test it. And you've got, what, 5 weeks now?" "5 weeks," Lenora said. Martha nodded, and this time when she left, she did not say she thought it was foolish, and she did not say she thought it would work. She said nothing at all, which from Martha Vickery was the loudest thing she could have said. Lenora needed wire. She had thought, watching the cloth, about anchoring, about the day a real wind would come and try to lift the whole snarled mass and throw it, and she knew she could not trust the sod and the tangle alone at the tall windward face. She needed to tie the heavy low trunks to stakes driven deep, at the points where the wind would push hardest, and for that she needed wire, and salt she was near out of, and lamp oil, and a stovepipe elbow to carry her smoke, and every one of those things cost money she could count in her sleep. She rode into Mobedi with Ruth up behind her on Bell, and $34 in her pocket that was already in her mind spent 3 times over. Mobedi was a small place beside the fort, a scatter of frame and picket buildings, a store, a smith, a few saloons for the soldiers. She tied Bell at the rail and went into the store with her list in her head, and she was counting coils of fence wire and finding she could afford only 2 when the door opened behind her and Mercer Blaine's voice filled the room. "Why, Mrs. Pritchard." He had 2 men with him, freighters or hangers-on, and he spoke to be heard. "Still with us, I see. Buying wire." He looked at the coils in her arms, and the smile came out. "Now, what does a woman alone want with fence wire and no cattle? You fence in the firewood so it don't run off?" One of the men behind him laughed. "You've heard, boys," Blaine went on, warming to it, playing to the store. "The widow out on the Sweetwater's building herself a fence out of the dead mesquite, stacking it up around her house. Says it'll keep out the winter." He shook his head with great sorrow. "I offered to buy the place back off her, out of Christian feeling. She'd rather stack thorn bush." The store had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it is deciding whether to laugh. It was then that Orson Bell spoke, from the back of the store where he had been buying nails, and he did not laugh, and what he said was worse than laughter because it was true. "It's not the notion that's foolish," Orson said. He came forward slow. "Brush will break a wind. Any drover knows that. But she's building it 20 foot if she's building it at all, and stacking it tight, and packing it with mud." He looked at Lenora, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat certainty of a man who had seen the graves. 20 foot of pack brush is a sail, ma'am. The wind won't go through a thing you've plastered solid. It'll get under it and push, and one hard norther out of the northwest will lay the whole of it over. On your house, like as not, or on you." He set his nails on the counter. "You're building a drift pile around your own house, and when the snow comes, it'll fill in behind that wall and bury you, and they'll dig you out in the spring." The words landed in the quiet store, and Lenora felt the men watching her to see if she would weep or shout. She did neither. She stood with the 2 coils of wire she could afford, and she turned Orson Bell's warning over in her mind the way she had turned the whole idea over in the dark, and she found, with a lurch that was almost gratitude, that he was right, and that being right he had just handed her the last thing she needed to know. He thought she meant to plaster it solid, and a solid wall would be a sail. He was right about the sail. He was only wrong about the wall, because she was not going to build a wall. "You're right, Mr. Bell," she said, and the store went quieter still, because no one had expected her to agree. "A solid wall would go over, so I won't build it solid. I'll build it so the wind goes through it and comes out the other side with nothing left in it." She set her 2 coils on the counter beside his nails. "I'm not plastering it shut. I'm packing the bottom foot where the ground wind runs and leaving the whole of it above open enough that a bird could fly through it in 10 places. It won't be a sail. It'll be a sieve." Orson Bell looked at her for a long moment. Something worked in his weathered face. He had come to town to buy nails and to be proven right, and instead a widow with bleeding hands had taken his own objection and used it to sharpen her plan, and he did not have an answer ready, and he was too honest a man to pretend he did. "We'll see," was all he said. But he said it different than the last time. The last time he had told her she would die. This time he said, "We'll see," and a man does not trouble to wait and see about a thing he is certain of. Blaine saw the room shift and did not like it. "Fine words," he said. "You'll be singing something else come January, and I'll still take the parcel back for $30 now, mind. Not 40, seeing the season's late." He touched his hat. "The offer keeps dropping the longer you're stubborn, Mrs. Pritchard. That's how offers work." "Then I'd best not be stubborn long," Lenora said. "I'd best just be done." She paid for her wire and her salt and her stovepipe elbow, and she came out of it with $11, and she rode back to the Sweetwater with Ruth's arms around her waist, and Orson Bell's words turning in her, not the old words that said she would die, but the new ones that told her exactly how the thing could fail. A sail. Get under it and push. Lay the whole of it over. She would not let the wind get under it. She would spread the load into the ground with buried stakes and wet sod, and the crooked wood locking crooked wood, and she would keep it a sieve and never a sail, and she would build it in the 5 weeks she had left, or she would not, but she would not die wondering. That afternoon she began in earnest. She laid out the whole of it first, walking the ground around her house with a spade, scratching a long irregular line in the dirt to mark where the barrier would run. It was not a ring. She made it heaviest and highest where the northwest wind came from, and lower along the north and west, and lowest of all on the southeast where she left the gate. A gap set off to the side, out of the wind's straight path, wide enough to lead Belle and the wagon through. The house would stand well back inside it, so that there was a broad sheltered yard between the tall windward face and her rotten west wall, and the wind would have spent itself in all that distance before it ever reached her home. Then she began to drag. Each trunk was its own small war. Belle hauled, and Lenora guided and levered and cursed under her breath, and the trunks came out of the brush, torn and shrieking, and she fitted each one into the growing barrier the way her father had taught her without knowing he was teaching her. Fork, biting fork, crown snarling into crown, the crooked wood locking so that no single trunk could be pulled free again without pulling 6 of its neighbors with it. She packed the bottom foot with sod as she went. She drove stakes at the windward points and turned her precious wire around the heavy low trunks and made them fast to the buried wood, so the wind would have to lift the earth itself before it lifted the wall. The work broke her body a piece at a time. Her hands, half healed, opened again. Her shoulders knotted and would not come loose even in sleep. She grew thin and then thinner, giving the larger share of the food to Ruth and telling the child she wasn't hungry. Ruth learned to sort the smaller branches by size and to keep the nails and staples in an old tobacco tin, and she worked beside her mother in the shortening days, and neither of them spoke much because there was no breath to spare for speaking. By the end of the first week, the northwest section ran 60 feet and stood higher than Lenora's head. She stepped back at dusk and looked at it and felt for one moment something dangerously close to hope. Then it rained. It rained 2 days, a cold, soaking autumn rain that turned the packed sod at the base of the newest work to mud. And on the second night, lying awake, Lenora heard through the drum of the rain a low, grinding groan from the northwest, a sound she had not heard before, and she was up and out into the wet dark with the lantern before she had thought to be afraid. 12 feet of the new wall had begun to lean. The mud she had packed at its foot had softened and let go, and the tall, snarled mass, heavy with rain, had settled outward, tilting toward the open ground, toward the very slope down which the first hard norther would come. In the lantern light she could see it leaning further. Even as she watched, slow as the hour hand of a clock, 12 feet of 40 tons finding out how to fall. She stood in the rain with the lantern held up and the water running cold down her neck. 5 weeks of everything she had leaning out over the mud in the dark, and she understood that she did not yet know whether she had spent her one autumn building a refuge or building the thing that would kill her. She worked the rest of that wet night trying to save it, and she could not. She drove a stake and lashed a rope from the leaning crown to the stake and hauled, and the wall came back a hand's width, and then the rope cut down into the soft mud, and the stake began to walk, and she saw that she was only teaching the whole mast to slide. She got a fence rail under it as a brace, and the rail sank into the mud to the depth of her forearm. By the gray of morning, she stood soaked to the skin, her hands past bleeding into something worse, and she watched 12 feet of a week's work lean out over the mud, and she thought clearly and without drama that the man had been right. Orson Bell had been right. She had built a thing that meant to fall. That was when the mule came up out of the wet dawn with a man on it, and behind the man came 2 more mules loaded with wool sacks and a coil of rope, and the tools of a life spent moving through hard country. He was an old man, dark and dry and weathered, with a wide hat gone shapeless from years of weather, and hands that looked carved out of the same mesquite she was fighting. He stopped his mule at a distance a polite man keeps, and he looked, not at her, but at the wall. He looked at the leaning section for a while. Then he looked at the older work behind it, the 60 feet she had built with the forks, locking fork against fork, and he sat looking at that longer than he had looked at the failure. "You built that first part yourself," he said. It was not a question. His English carried the round shape of Spanish under it. "Yes." "Nobody showed you to turn the forks in against each other." "My father, near enough," Lenora said. "A long time ago. He didn't know he was showing me." The old man got down off the mule. He walked to the good section and put his hand flat against the snarled wood and pushed, the way she had pushed the brush that first day, and it did not move, and something in his face eased. "My name is Eusebio Lujan," he said. "I run sheep and I move freight, and I have been through this country every winter for 30 years, and I have slept behind walls of brush and mud from here to the Pecos when there was nothing else to sleep behind." He turned and looked at the leaning 12 feet with something close to affection, the way a man looks at a familiar mistake. "You know how to build. You do not yet know how to keep it from falling down. Those are 2 different kinds of knowing. Come, bring your rope. We are not going to save this piece. We are going to take it down. Take it down." "You cannot brace a wet failure," Eusebio said. "You can only feed it more rope until it takes the rope with it. Down, then up again, but lower and wider at the foot, and this time we put the load into the ground where it belongs, and not into the top of the wall where the wind wants it." He was already pulling at the crown of the leaning section, unlocking it limb by limb, and after a moment she understood that he was not going to argue with her about it, and she took up her rope and went to help, and that was how it began. They dismantled the 12 feet in an hour and rebuilt it in a day, and by the end of that day, Lenora Pritchard had learned more about her own invention than she had learned in the 2 weeks she built it alone. The first thing Eusebio taught her was the thing her father had half taught her, but he taught it whole. She had been letting the forks lock where they happened to lock. Eusebio made it a law. Every trunk laid butt down and low, he said, the heavy end always toward the earth. Every fork turned to bite the branch of its neighbor, and the neighbors turned so that no 2 leaned the same way, one canting in and the next canting out, so that the wall wanted to hold itself together from the inside instead of wanting to fall as one piece. "You are asking crooked wood to stand straight," he said, when he found her trying to line a run of trunks up even and true. He pulled one of them out, turned it end for end, and let its natural bend drop into the hollow of the trunk below, and the two locked with a sound like a latch. Why? The crooked wood does not want to stand straight. It wants to lock. Let it do the thing it wants to do. A straight wall of straight wood falls straight. A crooked wall of crooked wood, he pushed it, and it held, and he pushed harder, and it held, has nowhere to fall. Every piece is holding 6 others down. The second thing he taught her was the ground. She had thought the strength of the thing was in its height, and Eusebio showed her that the height was the danger, and the ground was the strength. He had her cut a shallow trench along the windward foot of the wall and lay the first course of heavy trunks down into it, half buried, so the earth itself held their feet. Then he showed her the dead men, stout logs buried crossways behind the wall, out of sight under the sod, with wire run from the buried log up to the low trunks of the wall, so that to push the wall over the wind would first have to drag a buried log up through 3 feet of packed prairie. "This is old work," Eusebio said, tamping the sod down over a buried dead man with the flat of a spade. "In my country we build the walls of houses this way, sticks and mud and posts, all together, no one thing doing all the work. A house of only mud melts, a house of only sticks blows down, sticks and mud and a buried foot that stands 100 years. He looked at her wet, ruined hands, and for the first time at Ruth, who had come to watch and was solemnly sorting branches into piles by length. "You have been trying to make one thing do all the work, the brush, but the brush is only the top of it. The mud is the middle and the ground is the bottom, and if you love only the part you can see, the part you cannot see will kill you in the dark, like last night." The third thing he taught her was the thing that saved her life, though neither of them knew it yet, and it was the opposite of everything her fear told her to do. The coal was coming on harder now, and Lenora had begun, in her fear of the wind, to pack mud into every gap in the wall she could reach, filling the tangle solid, sealing it against the air. She wanted a fortress. She wanted a thing the wind could not touch, and Eusebio caught her at it one afternoon with a bucket of creek mud and made her stop. He did not lecture her. He built her 2 small test panels instead, side by side, in the open where a stiff cold breeze was running. One he packed nearly solid with mud, the way she had been doing. The other he left brushy and open above its packed foot, the way the good sections were. Then he tied a strip of her pale cloth on a stick and walked it slowly down the lee of each panel, and made her watch. Behind the solid panel, the cloth did not fall calm. It whipped and snapped and spun, worse in places than out in the open, because the wind had struck the solid face and leapt over the top of it and come crashing down behind in hard, tumbling rolls that reached clear to the ground. Behind the brushy panel, the cloth stirred and settled. The wind had gone into the brush and been broken, and had come out the far side with its back broken, spread thin and slow and quiet. "You see?" Eusebio said. He knocked the mud out of the upper gaps of the solid panel with the handle of his spade, opening it back up, and behind it the tumbling died and the cloth went quiet. "The wind is water. If you build a dam, the water climbs it and pours over and lands hard on the other side. If you build he searched for the word, a strainer, a thing full of holes, the water goes through slow and comes out with no strength. You do not want a dam. You want a strainer, pack the bottom foot where the ground wind cuts. Leave the rest of it hungry for wind. Let the wind in so you can take it apart." He handed her back her bucket of mud. "Fear tells you to close it up tight. Fear is wrong. The tight wall is the one that falls, and the one that does not fall is worse. It throws the wind down on your house harder than if you had built nothing at all." Lenora poured the mud back into the creek. That was the day her invention became a real thing, and not a lucky guess, because that was the day she stopped fighting the wind and started spending it. Eusebio did not stay to build it for her. He had freight to move and sheep to see to down the country, and he came and went over the weeks that followed, 3 days here and 2 there. And each time he came, he looked first at the wall and told her what she had done wrong since he left. And each time he told her less because she was making fewer mistakes. He never took the work from her hands. He would pull one trunk out to show her a better way, and then stand back and let her set the next 20 herself, and only grunt if she set them wrong. Belle went lame in the shoulder in the 3rd week of it. The mare had been dragging trunks day on day, and the collar had rubbed the top of her shoulder raw, and one morning she would not lean into it, and when Lenora looked, she found the sore gone deep and angry, and knew that to work her would ruin her. Without the mare there was no dragging. Without the dragging there was no wall. Lenora rested her, and salved the sore with what she had, and began carrying the smaller trunks herself, one at a time, on her own back across the clearing, and she made in a day what the mare had made in an hour, and the calendar did not slow to match her. It was Martha Vickery who saved that week. Martha rode in on a gray morning with her own team of 2 heavy horses and her husband's freight harness, and she did not make a speech about it. She backed the team to the brush and said, "I've got him till noon. Don't waste it." And the 2 women worked that team hard through the morning, dragging out more trunks before dinner than Lenora had moved in the 3 days since Belle went lame. At noon, Martha unhooked her horses to rest them and stood looking at the wall, which now ran better than half around the clearing and stood above the cabin roof along the whole northwest face. "I still think it's the strangest thing I ever saw a person do," Martha said. "I want you to know that hasn't changed." She wiped her face on her sleeve. "But I don't think you're building the wrong thing anymore. I thought you couldn't finish it. That's what I said, not that it was foolish that you couldn't finish. I was wrong about that part. You're going to finish it." She looked at Lenora's gaunt face and wrapped hands. "The question's just whether it'll finish you first." The days shortened. The nights hardened. By the middle of October, the wall stood 95 feet along the north and northwest and reached above the roof line where it mattered most. By the end of October, the northwest crown had risen higher than Lenora could reach, even standing in the wagon bed. Tall, stacked, interlocking crowns that clawed at the low sun, and the tallest of them, where 3 great forked trunks had locked together by luck and terrain, stood something near 20 feet. But most of the wall was nothing like 20 feet. Most of it stood 12 or 14, and it fell away to the height of a man along the southeast return, and lower still to the offset gate. And this was, as Eusebio said it must be, because a wall is only as tall as the wind that strikes it needs, and to build higher than that is to build a coffin for yourself out of your own labor. By the first week of November, more than half the intended enclosure was still open, and Lenora began to understand that she was in a race she might lose by days. She stopped sleeping to build it. She worked by lantern into the nights the weather allowed. Her weight had dropped so that her dresses hung on her, and Ruth had taken to watching her mother eat. To be sure she did, the way a small, anxious animal watches. Ruth had her jobs now, and did them without being told. The branch sorting, the nail tin, the feeding of the rested mare, the fetching of water, and there was a terrible grown quality in the 6-year-old that Lenora saw and grieved over and could not spare the child. Then Eusebio, come back through in the 2nd week of November, found the last thing that could kill them, and it was the thing all 3 skeptics had named from the very start. Fire. He walked the inside of the wall with her in the evening, a lantern in his hand, and he stopped where the tall, dry crown of the southeast section leaned near the corner of the cabin, and he held the lantern up, and he did not have to say it. Lenora saw it as he saw it. She had built her house a shelter out of 80,000 pounds of the driest, most flammable stuff in that whole country, and she had run her stovepipe up through the roof to throw sparks into the sky not 30 feet from where the driest of it stood. "One ember," Eusebio said. "One ember on a dry night with a wind, and you have made a bonfire with your house in the middle of it." He lowered the lantern. "We fix this now. Tonight we plan it. Tomorrow we do it." They did it over 3 days. They cleared the grass to bare mineral earth in a wide band around the cabin, so that if a spark fell, it would fall on dirt and die. They cut back the nearest crowns of brush so that no dry wood stood within reach of a chimney spark. Eusebio built the stovepipe higher, up above the wall's tallest crown, and packed the roof around it with wet clay, so the pipe threw its sparks up into open sky, and not sideways into the tangle. They stripped the loose grass from the inner foot of the whole wall, so that a fire, if it came, would have nothing to run along the ground. "It is still made of fire," Eusebio said when they were done, standing back to look at it in the last light. "You cannot change what it is made of. You can only make the fire have to work very hard. That is all any of this is. You cannot beat the winter. You can only make it work very hard to kill you, and hope it gives up first." By the end of November, the wall stood the whole way around. It was an irregular oval, close to 300 feet in the walking of it, heaviest and highest to the northwest where the killing wind would come, falling away to the sheltered southeast where the offset gate stood out of the wind's line. Perhaps 35 tons of the dead mesquite had gone into it, and a few tons more of the cleaner, straighter pieces stood ricked and covered by the house for stove wood, because the wall was not the only use she had found for the trash Blaine had sold her. It heated her, too. The house behind the wall was chinked tight now with clay and grass, its west wall doubled over with the worst of the salvaged boards, its door rehung, its windows shuttered. And around it stood the strangest fortification anyone in Wheeler County had ever seen. A snarled, black-woven mountain of thorn and mud and buried wood, and Lenora Pritchard stood inside it on the last day of November, with her hands ruined and her body worn to bone, and she had built it, and now she had only to find out whether it was worth anything at all. The first ordinary norther came the second week of December, and it gave her the first answer. It was not the storm. Everyone said so afterward. It was only a hard, cold blow out of the northwest, the kind that came a dozen times a winter, the kind that killed no one but reminded everyone what could. But Lenora stood in her sheltered yard while it ran, and she felt the difference in her own skin, and then she went and got her proof. She had no fine instruments. She had a glass thermometer her husband had owned, and she had her own senses. And she had the cleverness of a woman who has had to measure everything her whole life. She set a shallow dish of loose wood ash on the porch, inside the wall, and she went out through the offset gate and set another dish of ash on a stump in the open ground beyond. Then she waited an hour and looked. The ash in the open dish was gone, blown clean away, the dish scoured empty by the wind. The ash on the porch inside the wall sat undisturbed, a soft gray hill of it. Not a grain moved. Ruth stood in the middle of the yard, in the middle of the norther, and turned her face full into the wind, and the wind lifted her hair and stirred her coat, but it did not make her flinch or turn away, and the child laughed the first time Lenora had heard her laugh since the spring, because she had never in her life been able to stand and face a panhandle wind and have it do her no harm. Inside the cabin, the little stove burned low and steady, and the room stayed warm, and Lenora fed it a third of the wood she would have fed it in that wind a month before, and she understood the second half of what she had built. It was not only that the wall broke the wind, it was that the house, out of the wind, held its heat. And holding its heat it drank far less wood, and drinking less wood it might, only might, have enough to last until spring. Orson Bell rode out to see it in the middle of that norther, because word had reached him, and he sat his mule outside the offset gate a long time before he came in. He walked the sheltered yard with his hat holding to his head against a wind that was not there. He held his hand up in the lee of the northwest wall, the way Lenora had held hers up that first day. He looked at the two dishes of ash, the empty and the full. He said nothing for a long while, and Lenora let him say nothing, because she had learned that Orson Bell would come to the truth on his own if she did not push him, and that the truth he came to himself would hold. "I told you it would blow apart," he said at last. "It hasn't." "No. I told you it would be a sail and go over." He looked up at the tall crowns moving, for they did move. The whole wall shifted and groaned and swayed a little in the wind, alive with motion. "It's moving. Everything in me says a thing that moves like that is coming down. But it's not coming down. It's—" He searched for it, an honest man reaching past his own certainty. "It's moving so it doesn't have to break, like a wheat field. A wheat field bends flat in a wind and stands back up. A brick wall stands stiff, and then it falls." He was quiet again. "I've been wrong about a good many things in my life. I don't much like to be wrong about the ones where I told a woman she'd freeze to death." Then he said the thing that Lenora would remember, because it was the first crack in the wall of his doubt, and it was honest, and it was not enough. "But this isn't the weather," Orson said, and he looked north, past the wall, past the creek, to where the sky sat low and iron gray on the edge of the world. "This is a nothing wind, a December blow. You've beat a December blow, and that's more than I thought you'd do, and I'll say so to any man that asks me." He gathered his reins. "But the weather that matters comes in January, ma'am, and it comes off the top of the world, and it does not care what you've beaten before it got here. You've passed the small test. Pray you never see the big one." He rode away, and this time he looked at the wall as he went, and he looked at it a long time. Eusebio came through 2 days after the norther, and he did not praise the wall either, and that frightened Lenora more than Orson's warning. He walked the whole 300 feet of it slowly, and where the December wind had shifted a crown or worked a trunk loose, he stopped and they fixed it, tightening the wire on a dead man, locking a slipped fork back into its neighbor, packing fresh sod at a foot the wind had scoured. He worked in silence, and Lenora worked beside him, and she knew him well enough by now to know that the silence meant he was troubled. "It held the December wind," she said, when she could bear it no longer. "It held the December wind," Eusebio agreed. "You don't look glad of it." He straightened from the dead man he had been tamping, and he looked north, the same way Orson had looked north, and Lenora saw that the two men who agreed on nothing else agreed on this. "I have to go south," he said. "There is a freight contract to the Pecos I cannot let go, and I have wool of my own to move before the roads close, and if I do not go now, I do not go at all." He would not look at her while he said it. "I will be gone 3 weeks, maybe 4. I do not like to leave a thing before it has been tested for true. But a man has to eat, and the men waiting on that freight have to eat, and I cannot make the winter wait on me." "When will the real weather come?" Lenora asked. Eusebio Lujan looked north at the low iron sky, and he did not answer her, and that was the answer. He left the next morning with his 3 mules and his wool, going south down the Sweetwater in the cold, and Lenora and Ruth watched him go from the offset gate, and when he was gone, the wall seemed very large around them, and the two of them very small inside it. The real weather came the day after Christmas. Lenora heard it before she felt it. That was the thing she would tell people afterward, the thing they never quite believed. She was inside the cabin near midnight, banking the stove, when she heard the wall begin to speak. It started as a rising in the northwest, a sound like a great, slow, indrawn breath, and then the whole 300 feet of the thing came alive at once, thousands upon thousands of dry mesquite branches beginning to click and knock and grind against one another. A dry, rattling roar that swelled until it filled the whole night, and under it a deeper groaning as the buried feet took the load and the dead men came up tight against their wire. The wall was moving. The wall was moving more than it had ever moved, swaying and working in the dark, and every instinct Lenora had screamed that a thing moving like that was a thing about to fall. But it did not fall. It moved because it was built to move, and moving, it lived. She went to the door and opened it a hand's width, and the wind that reached her was a broken wind, a spent and stumbling thing, and past the wall, out in the open ground, she could see nothing at all, no stars, no horizon, no line between earth and sky, only a howling gray-black nothing where snow and dust and wind had erased the world. She had heard the drovers call it the razor. She understood the name now. The wind out there was a thing that would take the skin off a face in an hour and the life out of a body in 3, and it had come down off the top of the world exactly as Orson said it would, and it did not care what she had beaten before. Inside her wall, the yard was turbulent and cold and full of blown snow, but a person could stand in it. A person could cross it. A person could live in it. And inside the cabin, behind the tight-chinked walls, out of the razor, the little stove held the room. She lit the lamp, and she got her husband's glass thermometer, and she began through that long night to keep the measure of what she had built, because she was a woman who had always had to measure, and because keeping the measure kept the fear at arm's length. Near the outer face of the northwest wall, where she braved the gate to set the thermometer for a few minutes in the lee of the tall crown, the mercury sank until it stood near 10 below zero and out beyond the wall. In the open, she knew it stood far lower than that. But inside the cabin, with the stove burning steady and the wind broken before it reached the walls, the thermometer held in the low 60s through the worst of the night, and in the corner nearest the stove, where Ruth slept wrapped in every blanket they owned, it climbed once to 74 degrees, warmer than that child had been on any night since her father died. She did not tell herself the wall was keeping her warm. She was too honest, and Eusebio had taught her too well. The stove kept her warm, but the wall kept the razor off the stove's work, and a stove that does not have its heat torn away as fast as it can make it is a stove that can win. And out beyond the wall there were houses that night where the stove could not win, where the heat went out through the cracks as fast as it came off the fire, and Lenora knew it, and she thought of them, and she was right to. The pounding came at the gate near 2 in the morning. At first she thought it was the wall, a trunk working loose, and then she heard, under the roar, a small high sound that was not the wall, and she knew it was a voice, and she was through the door and across the yard before she had decided to move. She found a boy at the offset gate, on the wrong side of it, in the open, half in the snow. He was Martha Vickery's eldest, a boy of 12, and his face was the gray-white of frostbite, and his words came out broken. Their chimney had failed, he said. The mud had cracked, and the smoke had filled the house, and they had put the fire out to keep from choking, and now there was no fire, and the cold was coming into the house like water into a sinking boat, and his mother had sent him for help before the worst of it came. And now the worst of it had come, and he had walked 2 miles in the razor to reach the only warm place he knew of, the widow's strange wall, because everyone had heard of the widow's strange wall. Lenora had to choose in a breath. The gate stood offset, out of the wind, and it was her one weakness, the one gap in the thing, and to open it wide to bring the boy and whatever followed him inside was to invite the razor through her one door. She could hear Eusebio's voice telling her the gate was set where it was for a reason, that the wind must never find a straight path to the house. She did not hesitate long enough to finish hearing it. She dragged the gate inward and got the boy through and got it shut behind him, and she called Ruth from her bed to build up the blankets by the stove, and she wrapped the boy in them and put warm stones from the hearth against his frozen feet. And even as she did it, she was thinking of Martha and the younger child, still out there in a dying house 2 miles away in the dark. But Martha was already coming. Martha Vickery, who had said the wall was the strangest thing she ever saw, was at that moment walking 2 miles through the razor with her 4-year-old daughter bound to her chest inside her coat, walking toward the one warm place she knew of, and she reached the offset gate perhaps 20 minutes behind her son, near frozen, the child inside her coat alive and screaming, which was the best sound in the world because a screaming child is a living child. They got her in. They got the little one in. The cabin that was built for one woman and one girl now held 2 women and 3 children, and the little stove sheltered from the razor held them all, and the yard beyond the door roared with a wind that could not reach them. And that was the moment the fire started. No one ever knew for certain how. A spark from the built-up stove, most likely, thrown high out of the heightened pipe and caught by the strange rolling wind inside the wall and driven down, the one path they had not been able to close, into the dry inner crown of the southeast section, near the gate, where the driest and most sheltered brush stood. Ruth smelled it first. The child lifted her head from the little Vickery girl she had been minding and said, in a small, clear voice that cut through everything, "Mama, I smell smoke." Lenora was out the door in her stocking feet. The southeast crown was alight. A pocket of it, the size of a wagon bed, had caught and was burning with the low, fast, eager crackle of tinder dry wood, and the strange wind inside the wall was fanning it, and it stood not 40 feet from the cabin, and it was made, all of it, all 300 feet of exactly the same dry thorn that was now on fire. If your heart is in your throat right now, if you need to know whether the thing that saved her is about to kill her, stay with us. Subscribe and stay, because the next 10 minutes of that night decided everything. And what happens changes how you'll think about every choice she made. She could not throw water on it. That was the first thing she understood, standing in her stocking feet in the snow with the heat of it on her face. There was water in the barrel by the door, but if she threw water, it would freeze on the path, and on the gate, and in the yard, and she and 2 women and 3 children would have to move through that yard the rest of the night, and ice underfoot in the razor would kill them as surely as the fire. She could not fight the fire with water without opening a second grave, so she fought it the only way the wall had taught her, with earth, with snow, with the mud that was in the wall itself. She screamed for Martha, and Martha came, and the 2 of them took the spades and threw snow, great shovelfuls of the dry-blown snow that had drifted along the inner foot of the wall, up into the burning pocket, and where the snow struck the fire it hissed and beat it back, and they threw wet clay dug from beneath the snow, gobbets of it packed against the burning crown, smothering it, cutting off its air. Martha's boy, thawed enough to stand, dragged the little ones back into the cabin and shut the door on them and came back out to help, and the 3 of them worked in the roaring dark, throwing snow and mud up into the flames. And the fire, for all its eagerness, could not get down. It burned the dry upper crown where it had caught, the loose, hungry brush at the top, but when it reached down toward the foot of the wall, it found the sod and the mud and the packed earth of the lower course, the part Eusebio had made her build wet and heavy and solid. And there the fire had nothing to eat. It could not run down the wall to the ground, and it could not run along the ground because they had stripped the grass to bare earth in November, and so it stayed where it was, a burning pocket high in the southeast crown, cut off below, and it burned itself smaller as they buried it from beneath. Then Orson Bell came through the gate on foot, leading his mule, having ridden out from Obedi into the razor when he heard the vicary chimney had failed, for the whole thin country watched out for its own in a hard winter, and finding the vicary place dark and empty, he had come to the only warm place he could think of, the widow's strange wall. He came through the gate into the firelight, and he took in the whole of it in a glance, the burning crown, the two women throwing mud, and he did not stop to marvel. He drew the long knife he carried and went up onto the lower interlocked mass of the wall itself, climbing the thing that Lenora had built strong enough to climb, and he reached the burning limb at the top of the pocket, the one carrying the fire, and he cut it free with 3 hard strokes and threw it down into the yard, where it lay burning on the bare earth and could catch nothing, and the fire went out. It went out because it had been cut off below and cut off above and had nothing left to eat. And in the sudden dark after, with the razor still roaring beyond the wall and the smell of char thick in the cold, the 4 of them stood in the firelit yard breathing hard, and Orson Bell looked at the lower course of the wall, the wet, packed mud foot that had refused to burn, that had stopped the fire from ever reaching the ground, and he understood what it was and why she had built it so, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that the wall had not just said for her. Near dawn, the wall spoke once more, and this time it was the sound they had all been dreading, and it was the last test. A crack came from the northwest face, a great splitting report loud enough to be heard over the razor, and Lenora's heart stopped, because she knew that sound. It was the sound of the tallest crown giving way, the 20-foot stack of 3 locked forks at the highest windward point, and every soul in that yard knew that if the wall came down in the night in the razor, they would die. They ran out into the yard and looked up and watched the tall crown fold. It came backward, slow, the way the leaning section had come in the rain a lifetime ago, 20 feet of locked mesquite folding down out of the black sky, and everyone watching braced for the whole northwest face to unzip and follow it down and open the yard to the razor. It did not. The tall crown folded back and down and settled into the lower interwoven mass beneath it, and it stopped. It sank into the body of the wall like a wave sinking back into the sea, and the wall took it and held, because it had never been one rigid thing that must all stand or all fall, but 100 separate tangled sections, each holding its neighbors down, and when the tallest reached too high and the razor found it, it did the thing Eusebio had built it to do. It gave up its height to save its life. The wall lost some feet along the northwest that night, and it never stood so tall again, but it stood, and behind it the yard held, and behind the yard the cabin held, and behind the cabin's tight-chinked walls the little stove burned on, and 2 women and 3 children lived through the razor to see the morning. The wind eased by full light. It did not stop. It would blow 3 more days, but it eased enough that a person could see the world again, and what the world showed them, when they could see it, was the price of the night for everyone who had not built a strange wall. Out past the offset gate, along the fence lines to the north, the cattle had died. They had turned their tails to the razor and drifted before it the way cattle do, mile on mile, until they came up against a drift fence they could not pass, and there they had piled and frozen, and the draws were full of them, and this was happening that winter across the whole of the Panhandle, in numbers no one would ever truly count. Lenora stood at her gate in the first clear light and saw the edge of it, the dark shapes down along the distant fence, and she understood that the razor had done to the open country exactly what Orson had promised it would do, and that inside her wall 3 children who should by every reckoning be dead were instead asleep by a warm stove. She did not say anything about it. She did not proclaim that she had won. She had learned better than that from an old sheepman who looked north and would not answer. She went inside, and she looked at the wood ricked by the wall, the clean, straight mesquite she had saved out for burning, and she counted it. She counted how much the long night had cost her, and how much remained, and she found that with the wall breaking the razor and the tight house holding its heat, she had burned far less through the worst night of the winter than she would have burned in a single ordinary week in the naked cabin Blaine had sold her. There was wood enough. For the first time since the wagon stopped at the wall of thorn, there was wood enough to reach the spring. She sat down on the floor by the stove among the sleeping children, and she did not weep because she was too tired to weep, but she put her ruined hands flat on the warm floor and felt the heat of it come up into her palms, the heat that the razor had not been able to steal, and she thought of her father turning the crooked wood in his hands 20 years before, telling a 6-year-old girl that the stubborn pieces make the best blocks, that once you get them set, they do not move again for love nor money. Then she got up, because there were 3 more days of wind coming, and a boy with frostbitten feet to tend, and a mare to check, and a wall to walk, and a life, it seemed, after all, to live. The razor blew 3 more days, and then it let go of the country all at once, the way those storms do, and the sun came up on a still white world full of the dead. Along the drift fences to the north, the cattle lay in frozen drifts of their own bodies, and men rode out from Mobeetie and the scattered claims to count a loss that would take years to say out loud. Martha Vickery walked her children home to a cold house and a cracked chimney, and came back the same afternoon to help Lenora begin the repairs, because that was the kind of debt neither woman would ever mention, and both would always carry. Then the visitors began to come, and Lenora Pritchard stopped being a woman the country pitied, and became a woman the country could not explain. Orson Bell came first, 3 days after the wind died, and he came not on the errand of a doubter, but on the errand of a man who owes an accounting and means to pay it. He rode in through the offset gate and got down slow off his mule, and he walked the whole 300 feet of the wall without a word, the way he had walked it in the December norther, only now he was not looking for the flaw that would prove him right. He was looking at the burned pocket in the southeast crown, black and dead, and stopped. He was looking at the folded northwest crown that had given up its height and saved its life. He put his hand into the lower course where the fire had failed to catch, and he felt the packed mudfoot, hard as fired brick now with the cold, and he stood a long time with his hand against it. "I climbed this in the dark," he said at last, "the night of the fire. I climbed it to cut that limb free, and I want you to know what I was thinking while I climbed it. I was thinking, this is going to come apart under me, because I'd been telling everyone in that country for 2 months that it would come apart, and a man believes his own telling." He turned to face her. "It didn't come apart. I put my whole weight on a wall of dead brush and a razor wind, and it held me like a stone staircase." "Eusebio built the low course to be climbed," Lenora said. "He said a man might have to." "Then Eusebio's a better man than me, because I built you a coffin in my head and he built you a stair." Orson took his hat off, which she had never seen him do, an old teamster standing bareheaded in the cold before a widow half his age. "I told you it would move, you remember. I said a thing that moves like that is coming down." He looked up at the swaying crowns. "I understand it now. I didn't understand that you meant for it to. That's the whole of what I got wrong, and it's everything. I thought moving was failing. You built a thing that moves so it doesn't have to break." He put his hat back on. "I've built stiff things all my life, walls and wagons and gates. Stiff things break. I never once in 55 years thought to build a thing that would bend." It was the finest apology Lenora would ever receive, because it was not really an apology at all. It was a carpenter admitting he had learned something new about building at the age of 55 from a woman with no trade and no crew and no lumber, and there is no man harder to teach than one who has done a thing well his whole life, and no confession costlier than his. I'll want to know how you set those buried logs, Orson said, businesslike again, the moment passed. I've got a stock pen loses 2 head a winter to the north wind. If a body could put a low run of this along the north of a pen, not 20 foot, I don't mean just a man's height. He stopped and looked at her and understood that he had just begun asking her to teach him. He almost smiled. Well, I expect you know what I mean. I know what you mean, Lenora said. Come in the spring when the ground's soft and I'll show you the dead men. It's easy work when you're not racing the snow to do it. Martha's conversion was different because Martha had never doubted the idea, only the doing of it, and now Martha had lived a night inside the answer. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, one afternoon while they re-chinked her chimney. I've stood in 2 kinds of weather in the same storm now, Martha said, packing wet clay into the cracked flue with her thumbs. I've stood in my own house with the cold coming through the walls like the walls weren't there, and my baby screaming, and I've stood in your yard with the razor going over the top of us and a stove that could actually hold a room. Same storm, same hour of the same night, 2 different worlds, 2 miles apart. She wiped her hands. A person who's felt both of those can't ever call the thing foolish again. I don't care how strange it looks. I've felt the difference in my own child's face. And then Martha said the thing that turned the whole matter from a widow's lucky survival into something the country would carry forward. You're going to have to teach it, Martha said. You know that. Every family on this creek heard by now that the vickeries near froze, and the widow's brush wall kept 5 people warm. They're not going to leave you be. They're going to come wanting it, and most of them are going to want to do it wrong, pile it too high, or pack it solid like Orson thought you had, or build it up against the house so it'll burn them out. You're the only one who knows why it works. If you don't teach the why, somebody's going to copy the what and die of it, and it'll be your name they die under. That was the moment Lenora understood that surviving had been the easy part. They came all through that late winter and into the spring, the way Martha said they would. A rancher from up the Sweetwater who had lost half his herd against a drift fence and wanted a windbreak for what remained. A young couple 2 claims over, newlyweds on thin ground, terrified of their first Panhandle winter. An old widower who had heard and did not believe, and came to argue and stayed to measure. They came into this strange enclosure and stood in the still yard and felt the wind stop at the wall, and every one of them wanted the same thing, which was to be as safe as the widow was safe. And Lenora would not let a single one of them copy the wall. This was the thing that surprised the country most. They expected her to be proud, to want her great strange fortress admired and reproduced. Instead, she talked every one of them out of building what she had built. You don't want this, she told the rancher, standing in the sheltered yard. This is what a desperate woman built with no money and 40 acres of thorn and 1 winter to do it in. You've got money and a team and time. You don't need a wall 300 feet around and 20 feet high. You need a run of it along the north of your stock, 1.5 man high, no more, built the way I'll show you, and it'll do everything you need and cost you 1/10 of the misery. When the rancher looked disappointed, for a man who has lost half a herd wants to build something as big as his loss, she made him look at the burned pocket in her southeast crown. That's what 20 feet of dry brush wants to do. Burn. The taller and drier you build it, the more it wants to kill you the way it near killed me. Build low. Build so a fire can't climb it and a man can put it out with a wet sack. Height is not the thing. I built high because the forks locked high and I couldn't stop them, not because high was better. Most of what I built, I'd build lower if I had it to do again. She taught them the 3 things she had learned, which were the 3 things Eusebio had taught her. translated now into the plainer terms a neighbor could carry home. Lock the crooked wood against itself so no one piece can fall alone. Put the strength in the ground and not in the height. And never seal it solid. Leave it hungry for the wind, a strainer and not a dam, because the sealed wall is the one that goes over, and worse, the one that throws the wind down harder on the far side than if you had built nothing at all. She would not take pay for it. When the newlyweds tried to give her a dressed hog, she took half and made them keep half. And when the rancher offered coin, she took instead the loan of his team for a week to move the dead cattle off her own creek bottom before the thaw made them a plague. She traded knowledge for work and work for food, and she never once traded knowledge for money. And this too the country noticed, and it did more for her name than the wall itself. By spring there were 7 new brush windbreaks along that stretch of the Sweetwater, and not one of them looked like Lenora's wall. They were low runs on the north of stock pens, and mud-footed hedges along the windward side of soddies, and deliberate gapped barriers with the openings offset out of the wind the way she had set her gate. Nobody built a fortress. Everybody built a piece of the idea, sized to their own need, and that Lenora came to understand. Watching them go up one by one across the thawing country, that was what an invention actually was. Not the great strange monument she had raised in her desperation. The principle spread thin and sensible across a whole community, each family taking only as much of it as they needed, and no more. Mercer Blaine hated all of it. He had sold a widow a worthless tract expecting to bury her in it, and take it back in the spring for the price of a smile. And instead, the widow had lived, and worse than lived, she had made the worthless thing valuable. And worst of all, she had made herself the one person in the county everyone wanted to talk to. Blaine came out to the Sweetwater once that spring, ostensibly to look at land, and he sat his good bay horse at the edge of Lenora's clearing and looked at the strange wall and the still green garden coming up in its shelter, and he could not find the words he had come with. Luck, he said finally, to no one, because Lenora had not come out to meet him. It was a hard winter, and she got lucky. But he said it quietly, and he said it to himself, and it did not have the ring of a thing a man believes. The trouble for Blaine was not the wall. The trouble for Blaine was that the whole shape of the story had turned around and turned against him, and he could feel it turning. All that winter men had asked him how he came to sell such worthless ground to a widow with a child. Now that spring, they had stopped asking him anything at all. They rode past his land office and out to the Sweetwater, and they asked Lenora Pritchard whether the dead mesquite choking their own creek bottoms might be worth something after all. The insult he had built, the worthless brush, the doomed woman, had changed hands entirely, and now it belonged to him. He was the fool who had given away a fortune in thorn to the one person alive who knew what to do with it. Eusebio came back up the Sweetwater in April, his mules loaded lighter now, and he found Lenora at the northwest wall, alone, rebuilding the crown that had folded in the razor. He watched her a while before she knew he was there. She had the folded crown half apart and was setting it lower and wider, and she was doing it right. He could see she was doing it right, locking the forks, spreading the load, keeping it hungry, and he did not tell her so. He got down off his mule, and he walked over, and he did not pick up a single trunk. Instead, he asked her a question, and it was a different kind of question than he had ever asked her. "What are you making it do?" Eusebio said. Not, "How are you building it?" Not, "Why is that fork turned wrong?" What are you making it do? The question a man asks another builder, an equal, someone whose intentions he respects and does not presume to know. "Lower here," Lenora said, not stopping her work. "It stood too tall on this corner, and the razor found it. I'm bringing it down to the height it should have been, and spreading what I take off the top along the base. Same wood, better shape." Eusebio nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that is what I would do." And then he sat down on a stump and watched her rebuild it, and did not lift a hand, and Lenore understood that the teaching was over. Not the friendship. The teaching. He had come to see whether she could mend the thing without him, and she could, and both of them knew what that meant. They worked the burned southeast face together over the next days, and there they did clash, and the clash showed Lenora who the old man was in a way the teaching never had. She wanted to rebuild the burned crown taller and better than before, to make the southeast as strong as the northwest, to close the weakness the fire had found. Eusebio would not have it. "You want to make it perfect," he said. "You want no weak place anywhere. I understand. The fire frightened you, and you want to build the fear out of it." He shook his head. "You cannot. Listen to me. This thing will fail somewhere, someday, no matter how well you build it. Fire, or flood, or 40 years of sun. It is made of dead wood and mud, and it is not a mountain. It only looks like one to you because you carried every piece of it on your own back. The day you believe you have built a thing that cannot fail is the day it kills you, because you will stop watching it." He put his hand on the burned crown. "Build this lower. Leave a wide bare ground here on the fireside. Build it so that when it fails, not if, when, it fails small and safe, and where you can reach it. A wise builder does not build a thing that never breaks. He builds a thing that breaks gently." "You sound like a man who doesn't believe in building anything," Lenora said. And there was an edge in it, because she had bled for this wall and did not like to hear it called a thing that would one day fall. "I believe in building," Eusebio said. "I do not believe in staying." And there it was, the whole difference between them laid bare in a sentence. "All my life I have moved, sheep in the summer country, freight in the winter, my whole house on the backs of 3 mules. I build a wall of brush and mud. I sleep behind it a week. I leave it for the next man, and the weather takes it, and I do not mourn it. You." He looked at her, at the garden, at Ruth carrying water, at the whole rooted, staked-down life she had planted inside the wall. "You have put everything you are into one place and one wall. That is a brave thing. It is also a dangerous thing. A place can be taken from you. A wall can burn. I have never loved anything I could not carry, because I have seen what it does to a person to lose the thing they could not carry." He was quiet a moment. "I am not telling you I am right. I am telling you why I am the way I am. You asked." Lenora had not asked, not out loud, but she let it stand because she saw that the old man was telling her something he did not tell people, and that it had cost him something to say it, and that behind it was a whole life she would never fully know. A wife, maybe, or children, or a place, lost somewhere down the years in the moving country. Some grief that had taught a man never to love a thing with roots. She built the southeast face lower. She left the wide bare ground. She built it, as he said, to break gently. And in doing so, she stopped trying to make a monument and started making a tool. And that was the last and best thing Eusebio Lujan taught her, though he taught it by losing the argument on the surface and winning it underneath. He left in May. He did not make a long thing of it. He had a summer of sheep waiting in the high country to the west, and a man to meet, and the roads were open, and one morning his mules were loaded, and he stood at the offset gate with the whole strange enclosure at his back, and Lenora and Ruth before him. He crouched down to Ruth's height, which was hard for him, his bad knees cracking, and he took something out of his coat and put it in the child's hands. It was a piece of mesquite, a single forked fork of it, gray and hard and twisted, no longer than a man's forearm. Lenora knew it at once. It was the first trunk she had ever tried to force into a straight line. Months ago, the one she had wrestled with and cursed before Eusebio had ever appeared. the one he had pulled from her hands the first day and turned end for end and dropped into place with a sound like a latch. He had kept it. Through the whole winter, through the razor, through the freight run to the Pecos and back, the old man had kept the ugly little fork she had failed to straighten. "You keep this," he told Ruth. But he was talking to Lenora over the child's head. "When your mother forgets, and she will forget, everyone forgets. You show her this piece of wood. You tell her, this is the one she tried to make stand straight." He stood up, knees cracking again. He looked at Lenora. "You know what crooked wood does now," he said. "You do not need an old man to tell you. You never did, near enough. I only saved you some time." Then Eusebio Lujan got on his mule and rode south down the Sweetwater with his sheep and his freight, and his whole house on 3 mules' backs. And he did not look back, because he was a man who had taught himself long ago never to look back at a thing he was leaving. And Lenora stood at the gate and watched him grow small against the green spring country until the creek timber took him. She did not weep at the gate. She waited until the night, until Ruth was asleep with the crooked fork of mesquite tucked under her arm like a doll. And then Lenora went out alone into the sheltered yard under the stars and put her hand on the cold, rough body of the wall that the old man had taught her to build. And she stood there a long time in the dark with the whole living country breathing around her. The wall had been a wild thing when she started, a pile of desperate thorn. Now it was a made thing, and a man had made it with her. And the man was gone the way men in that country were always going, down a road toward a horizon, taking nothing with him but what he could carry and leaving behind, in the hands of a woman and a child, everything he knew. That was the only kind of monument such a man would ever build. Not a wall. A person who could build the wall without him. Then she went to bed, and in the morning she got up and walked the wall and found 2 places the spring rain had loosened, and she fixed them herself, and that was her morning, and it was enough, because it was exactly what he would have done. The dry weeks came in late May, and with them came the second test, the one every skeptic had named before she ever laid a trunk, the one Eusebio had made her build against with his bare-ground fire breaks and his broken, gently southeast face. It had not rained in near 3 weeks. The spring grass that had come up green in April had cured brown and brittle in the wind and the sun, and the whole country stood dry as tinder, and every soul on the Sweetwater knew what dry grass and wind could do in that season. Then, on a hot, hard afternoon, with the wind driving out of the southwest, a rider came pounding down the creek with the word that a grass fire had started miles off to the west, on the high ground, and was running before the wind and was coming. For Lenora Pritchard, it was the nightmare made real. She had built her family a shelter, her whole life, out of the driest, most flammable material in that country. A grass fire running before a southwest wind would come straight down onto the Sweetwater bottoms, straight onto her 300 feet of cured dead thorn. And if it reached the wall would not save her. The wall would become the fire. A roaring wall of flame around her house and her child and her garden and everything she had bled a winter to build. The old Lenora, the desperate one, might have stood and fought it alone at the wall with a wet sack and died there. But she was not that woman anymore. Eusebio had cured her of loving the wall more than she loved the truth, and the truth was that the wall was a tool and not a fortress, and a tool cannot save you from a thing you have not prepared for. So she did not run to the wall. She ran to the neighbors. She sent Ruth on Belle, who was sound again, to the Vickery place and told her to raise every family on the creek, and she rode herself to the ranchers and the newlyweds and the old widowers, and by the strength of a thing she had not had a year ago, the strength of being the one person on that creek whose judgment about wind and fire everyone now trusted, she pulled the whole scattered community together in an afternoon. If there's a piece of hard-won knowledge in your life, something you learned the painful way. Don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with someone who's facing their own long winter. The knowledge Lenora refused to hoard is the only reason what happened next didn't end in ash. She did not have them run to save her wall. She had them save the whole creek, and by saving the creek, save her wall along with it. Under her direction, and it was a direction now, given and taken without argument, a widow telling ranchers and old men where to dig and they digging, the community cut a wide fire break across the high ground to the west, plowing and burning a bare strip the running fire could not cross. They stripped the cured grass back from the windward side of every brush windbreak on the creek, hers and all 7 of the new ones, so that no fire could run up out of the grass into the dead wood. They wetted down sacks and filled barrels and posted men with shovels and wet burlap along the whole vulnerable line, and they did all of it before the fire came, in the hours they had, because the woman telling them what to do had learned the hardest lesson of her strange winter, that you do not fight the disaster when it arrives. You make it work very hard to reach you, long before it comes, and you hope it gives up first. The fire came down onto the Sweetwater at dusk, and it hit the plowed fire break on the high ground and starved. And where it tried to run down into the bottoms, it found the grass already stripped from the feet of the brush walls, and it found men and women with wet sacks standing ready at every gap, and it never reached a single windbreak on that creek. It burned itself out along the bare break in the night, and by morning it was black smoking ground and no more, and not one home was lost, and not one wall, and not one life. Lenora walked her own wall in the gray morning with the smell of grass smoke in the air, and she found it whole, untouched, saved not by its own strength, but by a whole community acting together before the danger came, and she understood, standing there, exactly how far she had traveled from the woman who watched 12 feet of wet wall lean out over the mud in the dark, believing she was alone. She was not alone anymore. She had made herself unalone, one taut neighbor at a time. Mercer Blaine saw it too. He had ridden out with the firefighting when the word went round, because even a man like Blaine does not sit in town while the country burns, and he had spent the night on the line with a wet sack like everyone else, and in the morning he stood on the black ground and watched a whole community pack up its shovels and its barrels and go home unburned, because a widow he had tried to kill with her own worthless land had told them what to do, and they had done it. He did not say anything to Lenora. He got on his good bay horse and rode back to Mobieti, and he was quiet the whole way, a man watching a story turn against him and not yet able to admit that the turning was just. That evening, when it was over, the rancher and the old widower and Martha Vickery and the young couple all lingered in Lenora's sheltered yard in the last light, tired and smoke-stained and alive, and the rancher said what all of them were thinking. "A year ago," he said, "the whole creek thought you were a crazy woman stacking thorn bush. Tonight the whole creek's alive because we did what you told us." He shook his head slowly. "How does that happen in 1 year?" Lenora looked at her wall. Lower now on the southeast, folded on the northwest, burned in one pocket and mended, a made thing and not a monument, standing around the life she had planted in the ruin Blaine had sold her. "One crooked piece at a time," she said, "locked against the next one, same as anything." She did not tell them she was quoting a man who had ridden away south in the spring and would likely never come back. She did not have to. She only had to keep saying his words in her own mouth until they became her words, and teaching them to the next person, and the next, until the day she forgot where they came from, the day Eusebio had promised would come, the day Ruth would hold up a crooked fork of gray mesquite and remind her. The country had a new authority on wind and fire now, and it was a 28-year-old widow, and the whole shape of her life had changed with the shape of the story. But two things were not finished, and Lenora knew it, standing in the smoke-scented dusk among the neighbors who trusted her. The man who had sold her a death sentence had not yet admitted what he had done, and she did not yet know what a life became out here after the winter you were supposed to die in, whether the wall and the teaching and the trust were the whole of it, or only the beginning of a thing she could not yet see the end of. By the second autumn, the strange enclosure on the Sweetwater had become a place people traveled to see before the cold came, the way they might travel to see a doctor or a preacher, and for the same reason, to be told how to live through the thing that might kill them. They came in September and October, when the light went thin and the first cold edges crept into the mornings, and every family that had lived through the razor remembered exactly what was coming. They came from farther now, from creeks 2 and 3 days off, because the story had traveled the way stories travel in an empty country, growing stranger with each telling until people rode 100 miles to see a fortress of thorn that could hold off the top of the world, and found instead a lean widow in a mended dress who talked them out of building a fortress at all. A typical day of it went like this. A family would arrive at the offset gate. Lenora never moved the gate. It stood offset to the wind as it had the night it saved the Vickeries, and she used it now as the first lesson before anyone got inside. "See where I set my door," she would say, "not facing the wind, off to the side out of its straight run. You do that with your own gate, your own door, before you do anything else, and you're half done." Then she would walk them through the sheltered yard, while the autumn wind ran over the top of the wall, and did not touch them, and she would let the stillness make her argument for her, because a person who has stood in that stillness with a norther going over their head does not need to be told the thing works. She taught the same 3 laws to every one of them. Lock the crooked wood against itself. Put the strength in the ground. Never seal it solid. And she taught them, above all 3, the law Eusebio had left her with the crooked fork. Build it to break gently, because it will break, and the builder who forgets that is the builder it kills. Ruth was 8 now, and she had become her mother's second voice. The child would take the visitors' children out into the yard and show them the small things, how to sort the branches by length, how to tell the crooked wood that locks from the straight wood that fails, how to pack the sod at the foot so the ground wind couldn't cut under. It frightened Lenora sometimes, how much the girl knew, how naturally she taught it. She had wanted Ruth to have a childhood, and instead the winter had given her daughter a trade, and Lenora did not know whether to grieve that or be grateful for it, and in the end she was both, the way a person is both about most of what a hard life hands their children. The land itself had changed, and this was the quietest victory and in some ways the largest. Lenora had not, that first desperate winter, cleared any of the mesquite except the path and the trunks that went into the wall. But now, with the wall built and the winter survivable, she began to do the thing Blaine had sold the land as being worth. She cleared it, slowly, deliberately, working outward from the cabin a little more each season. She grubbed the dead top-killed stems for the wall and for the stove, and where the mesquite sprouted green again from its stubborn roots, she cleared what she wanted cleared and left standing what held the creek bank and gave summer shade and fed the ground. She did not scour the tract bare the way a man in a hurry would have. She opened it in patches, and in the open patches she put in a garden that grew each year, and then a field, and then a second field, and the creek bottom that everyone had called worthless became, one cleared patch at a time, exactly the good productive ground Blaine had promised in his lie, only Lenora had made the lie true with her own hands, which was a thing Blaine had never once imagined a person could do. By the third autumn, she was selling seed potatoes and winter squash to the very families who came to learn the wall, and the tract that had cost her $144 and nearly her life was worth, by the county's own reckoning, more than 10 times that, and she owned it clear. And then, in the fourth winter, Mercer Blaine came to her gate not to gloat and not to buy, but to be taught. And the whole long story finally turned all the way around. It happened because Blaine had done well for himself in the years since, well enough to be running good horses now on the tract that adjoined Lenora's own, the land he had kept back when he sold her the choked creek bottom, thinking he had kept the better piece. He had a string of fine animals on it, worth real money. And when the cold came on that fourth winter, he did what half the county now did. He built himself a brush windbreak on the north of his horse lot. But Mercer Blaine had never once come to Lenora to learn how. He was too proud, and there was too much between them, and so he built it the way a clever man builds a thing he has only seen from a distance and never troubled to understand. He built it tall, because tall looks strong. He packed it solid with mud, sealing every gap, because a sealed wall looked stronger than an open one to a man who did not know that the wind is water. He built it, in short, as every skeptic had once wrongly imagined Lenora's own wall to be, a dam and not a strainer, a sail and not a sieve, the exact wall that Orson Bell had warned would go over in the first hard blow. The first hard blow came in December, a norther not half so bad as the razor, an ordinary killing wind of the kind that country got a dozen times a winter. And Mercer Blaine's tall, sealed wall did precisely what physics demanded of it. The wind struck the solid face and could not pass through, and so it climbed the wall and poured over the top and came crashing down on the far side in hard-rolling waves that fell straight onto the horse lot the wall was meant to protect, so that the animals in the lee of the wall stood in worse wind than if there had been no wall at all. And in the night, with the ground gone soft under an early thaw, and the wind getting under the sealed, unbreathing mass, a long section of it leaned, and then went over, and came down across the corner of the lot. No horses died. Blaine was lucky in that. But 2 were cut and lamed on the fallen brush. Good animals, worth more than Lenora had paid for her whole tract. And Blaine stood in the gray morning looking at his ruined wall and his hurt horses, and understood at last and all at once everything he had gotten wrong, not only about the wall, but about the woman, and about the land, and about the whole 4 years. He came to Lenora's gate that same afternoon. She saw him coming, and she went out to meet him, because she would not make a man stand at her gate in the cold, not even that man. He sat his good bay horse, older now, they both were, and for a long moment he did not speak, and Lenora did not speak for him. She had learned from Orson Bell that a proud man has to come to the truth in his own time, and that the truth he reaches himself is the only one that holds. "My wall went over," Blaine said finally. The words came hard. "Last night, came down on my horse lot, lame 2 head." He looked at Lenora's wall behind her, low now on the southeast, mended on the northwest, weathered and dark and standing as it had stood through 4 winters. "Mine's been up 2 weeks and it's flat on the ground. Yours has been up 4 years and it's still standing." He stopped. His jaw worked. Whatever he had rehearsed on the ride over, this was the part he could not get around. "I don't understand what I did wrong, and you're the only person in this country who does." He forced it out, the sentence that cost him everything, the sentence that undid 4 years of pride in 6 words. "Tell me what I missed." Lenora Pritchard looked at the man who had sold her a death sentence with a smile, who had offered her $40 and then $30 to walk off her own land and die somewhere he would not have to watch, who had called her survival luck and stood at her clearing's edge unable to say the words. She could have said any of it. She could have named the land sale, the trap, the dropping offer, the whole of it, and sent him home unhelped to lame more horses. No one in the county would have blamed her. Most would have cheered. She did not say any of it. "You built it solid," she said. "That's the whole of it. Near enough. You sealed it up tight because tight looks strong. But the wind's not a thing you can stop, Mr. Blaine. It's a thing you have to spend. You built a dam, and the wind climbed it, and fell on your horses harder than open sky would have. And you built it stiff, so when the wind got under it, it had nowhere to go but over." She looked at him plainly, without cruelty, exactly the way Orson Bell had once looked at her and told her she would die. "Build it so the wind goes through. Knock the mud out of everything but the bottom foot. Lock the crooked pieces against each other so no one piece can fall alone. And bury your footlogs deep so the wind has to lift the ground before it lifts the wall. Come spring, when the earth's soft, I'll walk your lot with you and show you where to set the dead men. It's easy work when you're not doing it in a panic." That was the whole of Blaine's reckoning. There was no more to it. She did not forgive him, and she did not make him beg, and he did not apologize, because men like Mercer Blaine do not have the words, and Lenora did not need to hear them. She simply answered his question, freely, the way she answered every question that came to her gate, and in doing so she did the one thing that his 4 years of pride could not survive. She treated him exactly like everyone else, like a man who needed to learn a thing she knew, not an enemy, not a villain, not the author of her near death, just another neighbor who had built his wall wrong and needed to be shown. And that was worse for Blaine and better for Lenora than any revenge could have been. A man can carry an enemy's hatred for a lifetime. It flatters him in a way to be hated. What Mercer Blaine could not carry was being helped, being made small, not by her anger, but by her indifference to it, being handed the knowledge he had tried to deny her as casually as she'd hand it to a stranger. He rode home that day, a man who understood that the widow he had tried to bury had not merely survived him. She had grown so far past him that his old cruelty could not even reach her anymore. It was too small. She had built something his judgment could not touch, and the only thing left for him to do was learn from it like everybody else. He came back in the spring, as she said he could, and she walked his horse lot with him and showed him the dead men, and he built his second wall right, and it held. They never became friends, but he never spoke a word against her again, and once, years on, she heard that a stranger in the Mobeedy store had called her strange wall a foolish thing, and that Mercer Blaine, of all men, had set down his glass and said, quiet and final, "You don't know what you're talking about. I've seen it hold 4 winters. Build your own the way she says, or don't build it at all." And that was the truest conversion of all. A hostile man defending in a saloon the very thing he had once mocked in that same room, and Lenora, when she heard it, only nodded, because by then she had learned that the world turns slowly and completely if you live long enough and keep telling the truth to whoever comes to your gate. The years after that ran together the way good years do. The community along the Sweetwater changed in ways a person could see if they rode the creek in winter. Where once every soddy and cabin had stood naked to the north wind, now the low dark runs of brush windbreak stood on the windward side of near every home and stock lot for 15 miles, offset gates and mud-footed feet and hungry open crowns, no two alike, each size to its own need. Nobody built a fortress. Everybody built a piece of the idea. Cattle that used to drift and die against the drift fences now wintered in the lee of windbreaks their owners had built with their own hands, and the losses that had once been counted in whole herds fell to a few head, and men who had never heard the widow's name built her walls without knowing whose they were, which was, Lenora came to think, the finest thing that could happen to a piece of knowledge, for it to spread so far and so common that it stopped belonging to anyone and just became the way things were done. Ruth grew up inside the wall. She grew up, that is, in a place where the wind stopped at a certain line, and the yard beyond that line was always still, and where in the hardest weather strangers arrived at the gate, frozen and left, days later, alive. That was the world the child took as ordinary, and it made her into a particular kind of person, unafraid of the cold, unafraid of strangers in trouble, certain in her bones that a bad thing coming could be prepared for if you were only willing to do the work early and ask your neighbors for their hands. She did not remember the razor. She had been 6 and asleep for most of it, and what she remembered of that winter was not terror, but her mother's warm floor and an old man who put a crooked stick in her hands and told her to keep it. The worst night of Lenora's life had passed over her daughter's head, like the wind over the wall, broken before it could reach her, and Lenora counted that among the things she had built, and counted it higher than the wall. The great original wall itself did not last, and Lenora did not try to make it. Eusebio had cured her of that. Season by season the old thing changed. A crown sagged and she took it down and burned it. A section of mudfoot eroded in a wet year, and she replaced the wood behind it with a lower, tidier run. A windward face that had done its work for a decade came apart in a storm, and she did not rebuild it tall, but built it the way she now told everyone to build, low and modular and easy to mend. The fire-blackened trunk she had carried on her own back that first autumn disappeared one by one into repairs and into the stove, until the desperate monument of her survival had been slowly, deliberately unbuilt and replaced with the calm managed shelter belts of a prosperous farm, lower walls, live trees planted and grown up thick along the north. Ordinary board fencing where board fencing made sense now that she could afford it. Some of the neighbors thought it a shame, the great strange wall coming down a piece at a time. Lenora did not. She had never loved the wall. She had loved what it did, and once the country knew how to do it too, the particular pile of thorns she had raised in her terror had done its whole job, and a tool that has done its job is meant to be set down. The only piece she never touched was a short run of the old northwest line, 10 feet of the original interlocked Mesquite, the very first section she had built with her own hands before Eusebio ever appeared. The crooked wood locked against crooked wood that had held through the razor and every winter since, that she left standing, not as a monument, as a reminder to herself of what the stubborn wood does once it is set. It does not move again for love nor money. Her father had told her that when she was 6 years old, and she had told it to Ruth, and Ruth would tell it to someone yet, and that was the wall that would outlast all the others, not the one made of wood, but the one made of the telling. Lenora Pritchard lived out her life on that creek. She grew old the way strong people grow old, slower than others, and all at once at the end. She saw Ruth marry a man who had first come to the gate as a boy to learn the wall, and she saw grandchildren run in the still yard where the wind never came, and she went on answering questions at her gate until she was too old to walk out to it, and then she answered them from a chair by the window that looked north over the low green shelter belts to the open country beyond. She never wrote any of it down. She said the wall wrote it down every winter for anyone with eyes. Late in her life, a young man came through the country writing up the old settlers for a newspaper, and he asked her whether it was true she had invented the brush windbreak, and Lenora laughed at him, an old woman's dry laugh, and told him no. People had been breaking the wind with brush and mud since before there were newspapers to ask about it, she said. She had not invented anything. She had only been poor enough and stubborn enough and desperate enough to take a thing everyone already knew and build it bigger than sense, in a place and a winter where building it bigger than sense was the only way left to live. Write that down, she told the young man. Don't write that I invented it. Write that I needed it. That's the truer thing. And it's the thing that might help the next woman somebody sells a bad piece of land to. She died in her own bed inside the shelter of her own trees, an old woman who had come to that country with a child and $34 and a wall of thorns she did not yet know she would build, and who left it the most trusted name on 15 miles of creek. That is the end of what can be told of her, and all of it is dramatized. The names, the words, the particular winter of one particular woman, drawn from a real country where real people really did break the killing wind with dead brush and packed earth, and really did survive the winters that killed their neighbors, exactly this way. More than 40 families along that stretch of the Sweetwater built windbreaks in the 10 years after the Razor winter, and not one of them built a fortress. They built low, mended runs sized to their own need, offset gates, hungry open crowns. The whole idea spread so thin and so common across the country that within a generation the people building them had forgotten there was ever a first one, or a woman who had carried it on her back through an autumn to keep her daughter from freezing. Lenora Pritchard lived out her years on that creek and grew old among the trees she had planted to replace the wall of thorn, and in her last years she would sit by the north window and watch the low green shelter belts bend in a wind that could no longer reach her, and she liked best the days when someone new came to the gate not knowing whose place it was, only that it was the place where a body could learn how not to freeze. The winter she was supposed to die, the Razor came down off the top of the world the day after Christmas and did not stop for 4 days, and the cattle piled dead against the drift fences, and a man named Orson Bell had stood in her broken clearing that first autumn and told her, plain as truth, "You're building a drift pile around your own house." Years after that winter, when the Great Wall had mostly come down and gone into the stove, Ruth, grown now, with children of her own, walked the old northwest line where only the first 10 feet of the original still stood, the crooked wood Lenora had locked together with her own bleeding hands before she knew what she was doing. She stopped at the end of it. She found one forked trunk buried half in the earth, gray and hard as iron, exactly as it had stood for all those years, still locked around the branch of its neighbor the way her mother had set it. She put her hand on it, the way she had seen her mother do 1,000 times. Then she took hold of it and pulled, to see if after all these years it would come free. It did not move. She pulled harder, with her whole grown weight, and the stubborn wood held its neighbor the way it had held through the Razor and 40 winters after, and it did not move for her at all, and she stood there in the cold with her hand on it and understood, the way her mother had once understood in the dark, that some things, once they are truly set, do not come apart again for anything on this earth.